The Galactic Assembly Hall was the largest structure ever built by any known species. It floated in the center of neutral space, held in place by 17 gravity anchors, each one the size of a small moon. Its walls were made of a material that could shift color depending on the mood of the session, deep blue for peace talks, pale gold for trade agreements, and a cold gray for disputed matters. On this particular day, the walls were gray. Thousands of delegates from across the galaxy filled the circular chamber. Some breathed methane through small tanks strapped to their backs. Some had no visible eyes. Some communicated through vibrations in the floor rather than spoken words. The noise inside the hall was a strange mix of clicks, hums, whistles, and translated speech pouring through earpiece communicators worn by every attendee. In a small observation gallery above the main floor, a human diplomatic family sat quietly and watched. Grant was a tall man with tired eyes and a calm face. He had spent 20 years representing Earth in places where humans were still considered newcomers. He wore a simple dark uniform with a small Earth flag stitched near the collar. He was not nervous. He had learned long ago that the best thing a human could do in a room full of powerful aliens was to stay still and pay attention. Beside him sat his sister, a woman named Paula, who worked as a cultural liaison for the Earth Diplomatic Corps. She had a notebook open on her lap and was writing small observations in quick handwriting. She noticed everything, the way certain delegates avoided eye contact with others, the way some factions sat closer together than the seating chart suggested, the small signals that told a story underneath the official one. And beside Paula sat a young girl named Lena. Lena was 9 years old. She had short brown hair and a habit of swinging her legs when she was bored, which Paula had quietly asked her to stop 3 times already. Lena was Grant's niece. She had begged for months to come along on this trip, and Grant had finally agreed because the assembly visit was supposed to be safe. Observers only. No danger. Just watching history happen from a comfortable seat above the noise. Lena pressed her face against the clear panel and stared down at the chamber floor below. "Which ones are talking right now?" she whispered. "The ones on the left side are the Vorkai," Paula whispered back, pointing carefully. "They control a system near the edge of the Arden Corridor. The ones on the right are the Sulhuri. They both want the same asteroid belt. Why? Because it has something valuable inside it." "What?" "Something neither of them wants to share." Lena nodded like this made complete sense and went back to watching. The session went on for several hours. Grant paid close attention to the voting patterns, the way certain senior delegates whispered to each other during breaks, and the translation errors that sometimes slipped through the communicators. He had a feeling the session was not going as smoothly as the official broadcast would later suggest. There was tension in the room that the formal language was trying very hard to cover. When the midday recess was called, the 3 of them walked down from the gallery and into one of the wide corridor rings that circled the outer edge of the assembly hall. These corridors were used by delegates and their staff to move between meeting rooms, rest areas, and communication terminals. They were busy, bright, and generally considered completely safe. Grant stopped at a communication terminal to send a short report back to Earth. Paula took Lena a little further down the corridor to find a food station, since Lena had been quietly mentioning for the last hour that she was hungry. That was when everything went wrong. The evacuation alarm was not the standard alert tone. It was sharper, faster, and it came with a flickering of the corridor lights that made everything look strange and unreal for a moment. Grant turned away from the terminal immediately. His training told him to move toward Paula and Lena first and ask questions later. But the corridor was already filling with people moving in all directions. What happened in the next 4 minutes would later be described in official assembly reports as a containment failure related to a pressure seal in a lower maintenance section. That was the official story. The truth, which Grant would only piece together much later, was that someone had triggered a controlled panic in that specific corridor ring at that specific time, for reasons that had nothing to do with a pressure seal and everything to do with what had been discussed in the session that morning. Grant pushed through the moving crowd, calling Paula's name. He found Paula against the far wall, her hand pressed to the side of her head, looking pale and shaken. She had been knocked down in the initial rush and had hit the wall on her way back up. She was not badly hurt. But she was alone. "Where is Lena?" Grant asked. Paula looked at him. Her face said everything before her mouth could. There was a smaller side corridor that branched off the main ring. It was used for equipment access and was not marked clearly for civilian use. In the confusion of the evacuation, Lena had apparently moved in that direction, possibly following someone, possibly just trying to get out of the crowd. The details were never made fully clear. What was clear was that something had discharged in that side corridor during the chaos. The Assembly's own incident report listed it as a secondary systems failure. It was logged as an accident. It was closed within 6 hours. Lena did not come back out of that corridor. Grant was told by 2 different Assembly medical officers, then by a senior delegate, and finally by the head of Assembly security. Each one used careful, quiet language. Each one expressed condolences. Each one mentioned how unusual this was, how deeply sorry they were, and how a full investigation would naturally be conducted in due course. Grant stood in a small white room and listened to all of it. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask angry questions. He looked at each person who spoke to him and he listened and he nodded and he said very little. Paula sat beside him and held his hand, and she was crying, but Grant did not cry. He sat with the kind of stillness that is not calm but is something much older than calm. Later, when the room was empty and Paula had been taken to the medical bay, Grant sat alone at a small table with a communication terminal in front of him. He thought for a long time. Then he opened a secure channel, entered a code that had never been used in his 20 years of diplomatic service, and typed a single short message addressed to a specific office on Earth that most people did not know existed. The message contained no demands. No threats. No emotional language. It contained only 3 things. Lena's name. The date. And the location. He sent it. Then he closed the terminal, folded his hands on the table, and waited. Somewhere across the galaxy, in a cold and silent orbit around the dark side of Neptune, something very old received the message and began, for the first time in 300 years, to wake up. The first drone that saw it sent back a single image before its signal cut out. The image was not clear. It was taken from far away, through layers of ice crystal and frozen gas that drifted in thick clouds around Neptune's outer orbit. But even through all of that, what the drone had captured was unmistakable. A shape. A massive shape. Long and dark and completely still, like something that had been sleeping for so long it had become part of the cold itself. The drone operator who received that image was a young Solhari analyst named Veek, working a routine monitoring shift at a small outpost 2 systems away. She stared at the image for a long time. Then she sent it up the chain without saying a word, because she did not have words for what she was looking at. Within 3 hours, it was on the desk of every senior intelligence officer in Assembly space. Within 6 hours, it was being discussed in emergency closed sessions on 14 different worlds. Within 12 hours, everyone was afraid. The outer orbit of Neptune had always been considered empty. Every major galactic survey conducted over the last 2 centuries had logged it as dead space, a cold, unremarkable region with nothing of interest beyond drifting ice and the occasional rock. Human vessels passed through the area sometimes, but humans passed through a lot of places without explaining themselves, and no species had ever thought to look more carefully. Now they were looking very carefully indeed. More drones were sent. Better ones, with stronger sensors and longer-range imaging equipment. They approached slowly, because whoever sent them was not entirely sure what they were approaching and did not want to find out the hard way. What they found was not 1 ship. It was not 10 ships. The fleet stretched across a region of space so wide that the drones had to travel for hours just to reach the far edge of it. The vessels were arranged in long, patient rows, each one locked in a slow frozen orbit that had kept them perfectly preserved through 300 years of deep space cold. They were dark. No lights. No engine output. No heat signature beyond the faint background radiation that everything in space carries. From a distance, they looked like natural formations. Like rocks. Like nothing. Up close, they looked like nothing any species had ever built. The design was unlike anything in the assembly's architectural records. The hulls were not smooth, they had a layered, structured surface that the drone sensors could not fully read, as if the material itself was deflecting the scans. The ships were large. Not just large in the way that transport vessels or colony ships were large. Large in the way that made the drones seem like insects hovering near sleeping giants. The smallest vessel in the fleet was 3 times the size of the assembly's largest warship. There were hundreds of them. In the assembly hall, the gray walls had returned. The session that had been called was not a formal one. There was no prepared agenda, no translation schedule, no seating arrangement. Delegates had simply arrived because no one knew what else to do, and being in the same room as other frightened people felt slightly better than being frightened alone. The Vorkai senior delegate stood up first. He was a tall species, with long fingers that he pressed flat against the speaking podium when he was trying to stay calm. He was pressing them very flat right now. "How long have they been there?" he asked. The Assembly's chief intelligence coordinator, a Sulhuri official named Praz, pulled up the analysis on the central display. Based on orbital drift patterns and ice formation data, our best estimate is approximately 300 years. Give or take a decade. The room was quiet. 300 years, the Vorkai delegate repeated slowly. Yes. And no one saw them. They were designed not to be seen, Praz said simply. The hull material scatters sensor signals. The orbital path was calculated to keep them inside the natural ice clouds. The heat output is essentially zero. Whoever designed this concealment did not do it quickly or carelessly. This took a very long time to plan. Another delegate, a small species from the Arden system who communicated through a voice translator box, spoke up from the far side of the room. "Are they armed?" Praz looked at his data screen for a moment. "We cannot get a full weapons reading. The hull material is blocking detailed scans. But based on the structural design and the size of certain external formations that our analysts believe are weapon housings," he paused. "Yes. We believe they are armed. Heavily." The room got quieter. On Earth, things were moving. Not loudly. Not visibly. There were no public announcements, no news broadcasts, no government speeches. From the outside, Earth looked exactly the same as it always did, busy, warm, a little disorganized, full of humans going about their ordinary lives with no apparent awareness of anything unusual happening. But in certain places, behind certain doors, people who had been waiting for a very specific signal were now moving with quiet and total purpose. The facility that coordinated the fleet's awakening was not located in any major city. It was built into a mountain range in a part of the world that most maps listed as protected wilderness. It had been there for a long time. The people who worked inside it had inherited their posts from people who had inherited their posts from people who had been there when the fleet was first put to sleep. They had a name for this moment. They had always called it the morning call. Not because it was romantic or dramatic, but simply because the first system that was ever activated during a full fleet wake was the lighting system, and when the lights came on inside those dark ships for the first time in 3 centuries, it looked, on the monitoring screens, like a slow and distant sunrise. The engineer who pressed the initial activation sequence was a woman named Ruth. She was not young. She had worked in the facility for 31 years and had run the morning call simulation so many times that she sometimes saw the sequence in her sleep. But the real thing, she found, was different from the simulation. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But somewhere behind her ribs there was a feeling she did not have a name for. She pressed the sequence. Across the solar system, in the frozen dark of Neptune's outer orbit, 300 years of silence ended. The lights came on first. Then the power cores. Then, one by one, in a slow and patient order that followed a very old activation schedule, the engines began their startup cycles. The ice that had built up on the hulls cracked and drifted away in slow clouds. The ships began to move. Not fast. Not dramatically. Just a quiet shift in orbital position, the way a person shifts their weight when they are about to stand up. The drones watching from a careful distance recorded everything and sent it back immediately. In the assembly hall, Praz received the new footage mid-session. He watched it for 10 seconds. Then he looked up at the room full of delegates and said, in a very flat voice, "They are waking them up." No one spoke. Because there was nothing to say that would make the next part of this any easier. The file that the Assembly's Intelligence Division pulled up on Admiral Sarah Voss was very short. That was the first strange thing. For a woman who had apparently commanded the most powerful hidden fleet in human history, her official record contained almost nothing. A birth record from a small coastal town in the north of England. A brief entry in an early military enrollment list. A service record that covered 4 years and then stopped completely. And at the bottom of the file, in plain text with no additional detail, a death certificate dated 31 years ago. Cause of death was listed as a training accident. No location. No details. No attending physician. No burial record. Praz stared at the file for a long time. Then he pulled up the footage from the drone feeds again and looked at the flagship of the awakened fleet. It was the largest ship in the formation. It sat at the front of the long rows like something that had always been in charge and had never needed to announce it. Its hull was darker than the others, and its surface had a faint pattern running along the upper sections that the analysts had not been able to identify yet. Praz had a feeling that the woman listed as dead 31 years ago was sitting inside that ship right now. He was correct. Sarah Voss was 63 years old, and she looked exactly like someone who had spent most of her adult life preparing for one specific moment and was now completely ready for it. She was not tall. She had short gray hair cut very close to her head, and her face had the kind of lines that come not from age alone but from years of thinking hard about difficult things. She wore a plain dark uniform with no decorations on it. No medals. No rank pins. No flags. She had always believed that the work itself was the only decoration that mattered. She was sitting in the command chair of the flagship's main bridge when her communications officer, a quiet young man named Carl, told her that the assembly was attempting to open a channel. "How many times have they tried?" she asked. 17, Admiral. She nodded slowly. "Let them try 4 more times. Then accept." Carl looked at her for just a moment, then turned back to his station without a word. He had worked with Sarah Voss for 9 years. He had learned very early that she did not do things without a reason, and that asking for the reason before she was ready to give it was a waste of both their time. 4 more attempts came through. Sarah sat quietly through each one, watching the main display screen which showed the fleet spread out behind the flagship in long steady rows. Every ship was now fully awake. Every engine was running at low power. Every system was online and reading clean. 300 years of cold sleep and not a single critical failure across the entire fleet. She felt something about that which she did not show on her face. The 21st attempt came in. "Accepted," she said. The assembly chamber went completely silent when the channel opened. They had been expecting many things. They had prepared for anger. Several delegates had quietly suggested that the human response would be emotional, possibly unstable, and that the best approach was to remain calm and let them exhaust themselves. Others had suggested offering an immediate formal apology and a financial settlement. A small number had suggested that the Assembly's own defensive fleet be put on alert, just as a precaution. None of them had prepared for Sarah Voss. She appeared on the central display screen without any introduction. She was sitting straight in her chair, her hands resting flat on the armrests, her expression completely neutral. She did not look angry. She did not look upset. She looked like someone who had already decided how a conversation was going to end before it began, and was simply waiting for the other side to catch up. She spoke first, without waiting to be addressed. My name is Sarah Voss. I hold the rank of Admiral in Earth's Reserve Command. I am currently aboard the flagship of Earth's Third Deep Fleet, which you have by now observed in full. She paused for exactly 1 second. I am not calling to negotiate. I am not calling to threaten. I am calling to inform you of one thing, clearly and once. The chamber was so quiet that the soft hum of the translation systems was audible. A human child named Lena was killed inside assembly-controlled space during a deliberate and coordinated action. The Assembly's own officials made a decision to conceal this fact. That decision was wrong. Earth requires full accountability. This means the names of every individual involved in both the action and the concealment, a complete and unaltered record of what occurred, and a formal acknowledgement delivered on an open channel to every species currently represented in this assembly. She let that sit for a moment. Nothing more than that. Nothing less. A senior delegate started to speak. Sarah continued without acknowledging him. Every 24 hours that passes without a response that satisfies those 3 requirements, this fleet will advance further into assembly space. We will not fire first. We will not make additional demands. We will simply keep moving. Slowly. Steadily. The way humans have always moved when they have made up their minds about something. She looked directly into the channel with an expression that was not unkind and not hostile and was somehow more serious than either of those things could have been. I think you will find that we are very patient. She closed the channel. The assembly chamber erupted the moment the screen went dark. 14 delegates tried to speak at once. 2 factions immediately began arguing with each other about who bore greater responsibility for the situation. The Vorkai senior delegate stood at his podium pressing his long fingers so flat against the surface that the tips had gone pale. Praz sat in his chair and did not join the noise. He was thinking about something Sarah Voss had said. Not the demands, which were clear enough. Not the part about the fleet moving, which was frightening enough. He was thinking about the way she had spoken. The complete absence of heat in her voice. In his long career of studying conflict and the species that caused it, Praz had learned one reliable rule. Anger burns out. Rage peaks and then falls. Emotional confrontation exhausts itself eventually, and when it does, there is room to negotiate. But Sarah Voss had not sounded angry. She had sounded finished. As if the decision had been made so long ago and so thoroughly that there was simply nothing left to feel about it except the doing of it. That, Praz understood with a cold and settling certainty, was much harder to negotiate with than anger. He pulled up the fleet's current position on his screen. Then he looked at the slow, steady movement of the formation and confirmed what he already suspected. They were already closer than they had been an hour ago. She had not waited for a response before beginning to move. She had simply kept her word. The fleet moved slowly. That was the part that frightened everyone the most. A fast-moving fleet could be tracked, predicted, planned around. A fleet that charges toward you gives you something to react to, something to meet with speed and decision. But the Earth fleet did not charge. It did not rush. It moved the way a tide moves. Steady, unhurried, completely indifferent to the idea that anything might stop it. Every 24 hours it advanced exactly as Sarah Voss had promised, and every 24 hours the distance between it and assembly space became a little smaller. The alien crews stationed along the outer rim watched it come and did not know what to do. Some of them had been ordered to hold position and monitor. Others had been quietly told to stay out of the fleet's path without making it obvious that they were doing so. No one had been ordered to engage, because no one in the Assembly's military structure was willing to be the one who fired first at something that size and found out immediately whether that had been a good idea. So they watched. And while they watched, they listened. It started with a junior signals officer on a Sulhuri monitoring vessel called the Prath Den. Her name was Sovi, and she was 22 years old and had been in active service for less than a year. She was running a routine electromagnetic scan of the space around the advancing fleet when she picked up something unexpected on an old frequency band. It was a broadcast. Human in origin. Very old, based on the signal degradation. She almost logged it as background noise and moved on. Instead, something made her put her earpiece in and listen. It was a voice. A human voice, speaking in one of the primary Earth languages, slow and clear. The translation system took a few seconds to catch up, and then the words began to come through in her own language. The voice was reading names. Just names. One after another, in a steady and careful rhythm, as if each name deserved exactly the same amount of time and attention as the one before it. The broadcast was a memorial recording, she realized. Something humans had transmitted into open space a long time ago, perhaps so that the names would travel further than any stone monument could reach. The names went on for a very long time. Sovi sat and listened to all of them. When it ended, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she flagged the frequency and kept scanning. She found more. Not just one old broadcast but dozens of them, layered across several frequency bands, some older than others, all drifting outward from the direction of Earth like ripples from a stone dropped into still water a very long time ago. War memorial speeches. Recorded ceremonies where humans stood in large quiet groups while names were read aloud and bells were rung. Children's choirs singing slow songs in minor keys. A recording of a woman's voice, clearly elderly, reading a handwritten letter addressed to a son who had not come home from somewhere. A documentary about a human monument that contained the names of the dead carved into long black stone walls, and the way humans would press their fingers against a specific name and stand very still for a while. Sovi shared the files with her crew. By the end of the watch cycle, no one on the Prath Den was talking very much. The files spread quickly across the outer rim stations. Signals officers shared them with crew members who shared them with officers on other vessels who sent them back to their home systems. No one ordered this to happen. It happened because the broadcasts were strange and because strange things get passed around, especially when everyone is already nervous and looking for ways to understand what is coming toward them. What the crews found, the more they listened, was something they had not expected. They had expected humans to be angry. The entire assembly had been preparing for human anger since the moment Grant had sent his message from that small white room. Anger was something every species understood. Anger peaks and spills and eventually runs dry. Anger wants to be seen, wants to be heard, wants to be answered. But the broadcasts were not angry. They were sad. Deeply, quietly, endlessly sad. And underneath the sadness there was something else, a kind of stubborn refusal to let go, a determination to keep saying the names, keep lighting the candles, keep pressing fingers against carved stone, year after year after year, long after the point where most species would have considered the matter settled by time. A senior crew member on one of the Vorkai border vessels, a veteran named Haas who had served for 30 years and considered himself very difficult to unsettle, listened to one of the memorial broadcasts 3 times in a row. Then he went to find his captain and said something that his captain later repeated to the Assembly Intelligence Division. He said, "I always thought the dangerous thing about humans was their strength. I was wrong. The dangerous thing about humans is that they do not forget. Ever. We are not dealing with a species that is angry about what happened to that child. We are dealing with a species that will still be remembering what happened to that child in 300 years. And they will still be coming." His captain had no answer for that. Grant was not watching the fleet's progress on any screen. He was sitting in a small private meeting room on the outer edge of the assembly complex, across a narrow table from a delegate named Nora. Nora was from a mid-sized species called the Aran, who had lived in the same star system for so long that they had a cultural reputation for patience and careful thought. She was older than she looked, with a calm face and steady eyes, and she had voted against the cover-up on the day it had been proposed in closed session. She had been the only one. That vote had cost her. She had been removed from 2 committees. Several colleagues had stopped speaking to her. Her government had quietly suggested she consider early retirement. She had ignored all of it and stayed at her post, because she believed that staying was the right thing and she had a habit of doing the right thing even when it was inconvenient. Grant had found her through a mutual contact 3 days ago. He had sent a very simple message asking if she would meet with him. She had replied within the hour with a single word. Yes. They had been meeting every day since. Not loudly. Not officially. No record of the meetings had been filed anywhere. They sat across from each other with cups of something warm between them and they talked slowly and carefully about what was possible. The votes are not there yet, Nora said quietly on this particular evening. She had a habit of getting straight to the point, which Grant appreciated. There are 7 delegates who are close. But close is not enough. What do they need? Grant asked. Nora thought for a moment. They need to believe that accountability is survivable, she said. Right now they are frightened. Frightened people make bad decisions. They need someone to show them that admitting what happened does not mean the end of the assembly. Grant looked at his hands on the table. Outside the small window of the meeting room, the stars were very still and very far away. I can give them a path, he said quietly. But they have to take the first step themselves. I cannot take it for them. Nora nodded slowly. Then we keep talking, she said. Grant agreed. Because the fleet was still moving. And the names were still being read somewhere out in the dark between the stars. And a 9-year-old girl named Lena deserved better than silence. So they kept talking. The fleet stopped. It did not stop dramatically. There was no sudden halt, no sharp change in formation, no signal sent ahead to announce the pause. The ship simply slowed, over the course of several hours, until they were holding position just outside the boundary line that marked the beginning of official assembly space. Then they were still. The outer rim stations recorded the change immediately and sent word back to the assembly hall within minutes. By the time the report reached the main chamber, half the delegates were already out of their seats and crowding around the central display, watching the fleet's position marker sit quietly on the map like a question waiting to be answered. No one knew what it meant. Some thought it was a tactical pause. Others thought it was a warning. A few thought that something had gone wrong inside the fleet and the humans were dealing with a problem they had not expected. The Assembly's military advisors offered 3 different interpretations in the space of 1 hour, each one contradicting the last. Praz looked at the display for a long time and said nothing. He had a feeling he knew exactly what it meant. It meant that someone had asked the fleet to wait. And there was only one person outside the fleet who could have done that. Grant had asked for 1 more day. He had sent the request to Sarah through the same encrypted channel that had carried his very first message from the small white room. The request was short. He told her that the votes were close. That Nora had worked through the night for 3 days in a row and had moved 5 of the 7 delegates they needed. That the remaining 2 were frightened but not unreachable. That he needed a little more time. Sarah had read the message once. Then she had told Carl to hold the fleet's position and gone to stand at the wide forward viewport of the flagship's bridge. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the stars. She had not slept much in the past week. Not because she was anxious, but because there was a particular kind of stillness that came over her in the hours when the ship was quiet and the crew was resting, and in that stillness she found herself thinking about things she did not think about during the busy hours. She thought about the 31 years she had spent in a role that no public record acknowledged. She thought about the people who had trained her and the people she had trained after them. She thought about what it meant to carry something for a very long time without putting it down. And she thought about a 9-year-old girl she had never met, who had pressed her face against a clear panel to watch history happen from a comfortable seat, and had not come back out of a side corridor. She gave Grant his extra day. The 2 remaining delegates were not cruel people. That was the thing Nora had understood about them from the beginning, and it was the thing she kept coming back to in her final conversations with each of them. They had not voted for the cover-up because they were heartless. They had voted for it because they were afraid, and because in the moment when the vote had been called, fear had been louder than conscience. Nora sat with the first one, a quiet older delegate named Pell, in his private office for 2 hours. She did not argue with him. She did not list reasons or present data or remind him of what the fleet was doing just outside assembly space. She simply talked to him about what it felt like to vote against the cover-up on that day. What it had cost her. And why, despite everything it had cost her, she had never once wished she had voted differently. Pell listened. He asked a few questions. He looked out his window for a while. Then he signed. The second delegate was harder. Her name was Sable, and she was younger than the others and had more to lose politically, or believed she did, which amounted to the same thing. Nora brought Grant with her to that meeting, because she felt that Sable needed to hear from a human directly. Not about the fleet. Not about consequences. Just about Lena. Grant talked about his niece for a long time in that quiet room. He talked about the way she swung her legs when she was bored. The way she asked questions about everything she saw. The way she had pressed her face against the clear panel to get a better look at the chamber below because she did not want to miss anything. He talked about these things in a plain and simple voice without any attempt to make them dramatic, because they did not need to be made dramatic. They were just true. Sable sat very still through all of it. When Grant finished, she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she reached for the document and signed her name. Grant sent the sealed transmission to Sarah that evening. It contained everything. The signed accountability documents carrying the names of every individual involved in both the action and the cover-up. The full unaltered record of what had happened in that side corridor and every decision made afterward. And a formal proposal, signed by a majority of the Assembly's delegates, to inscribe a name on the Galactic Hall of the Innocent. The first human name ever to appear there. Lena. Sarah received the transmission on the bridge of the flagship. Carl handed her the notification quietly and then stepped back to give her space. The rest of the bridge crew continued their work without looking up, because they had all learned from long experience that Admiral Voss preferred to receive important things without an audience. She opened the transmission. She read through every document slowly and carefully, the way she read everything. She checked the signatures. She checked the records. She read the monument proposal twice. Then she sat still for a moment with her hands flat on the armrests of her command chair, looking at nothing in particular. She thought about what Grant had done. About what Nora had done. About the weeks of quiet, patient, unglamorous work that had moved frightened people toward the right thing, one careful conversation at a time. It was, she thought, its own kind of courage. Different from the kind she was more familiar with, but not smaller. She stood up. "Carl," she said. "Open a channel. Full broadcast. Every frequency. I want every vessel in this fleet to hear it, and I want it open to all assembly bands as well." Carl looked up. "All bands, Admiral. That will reach everyone," Sarah said simply. "Yes." Carl turned back to his station. 30 seconds later he said, "Channel is open, Admiral. You are broadcasting." Sarah stood at the front of the bridge and looked at the stars through the wide viewport. The fleet spread out behind her in long steady rows, 300 years old and fully awake, every ship listening. She took a breath. Then she spoke Lena's name. She said it slowly. She said it clearly. She gave it exactly the weight it deserved, which was the same weight she would have given any name, because that was the point. That had always been the point. Not power. Not the fleet. Not the long cold years of waiting or the careful march through assembly space or the frightened delegates in their private offices signing their names at last. The point was one child who had gone down a side corridor and not come back, and who deserved to be remembered by a galaxy that had tried very hard to forget her. Sarah said her name once. The channel stayed open for a long moment of complete silence afterward. Then she said quietly, "Stand the fleet down. Take us home." And across the galaxy, on 14 worlds and 100 stations and the small Sulhuri monitoring vessel where a young signals officer named Sovi was still at her post, everyone who had heard it sat with the sound of that name for a while. Because some things, once said clearly enough, stay said forever.